All right, this talk is actually going to be about lucidity, which I don't spend very much time on because, to be frank with you, it fucking scared the shit out of me before. But I had a revelation today that I think makes all of it tie together pretty fucking well. So I think the way that this is the way that God is that God, what makes God God is that he affirms everything. Uh, it's like the exact opposite of nihilism. It's the exact opposite of the devil. It's the exact opposite of absolute negation, which is where I started my work. The theory all started from the really the seed of the entire thing can be found in the paradox of absolute negation. And the reason that that's a paradox is because if it's absolute, then it applies to itself. It includes itself within the purview of its own function, which means that it negates itself. But how could it negate itself if it is, in fact, negating everything? And that's a paradox. In other words, it would be like if negation was, let's say, murdering, right? Because that's basically what it leads to, is the cessation of whatever it is that's being negated. So it should work functionally analogously to murder. So if there was someone who murdered everyone, then that person would have to also murder themselves. Depending on the order in which that occurred, it might not actually be possible to murder everyone. For example, if he starts with himself or herself or whatever, if they start with themselves, obviously they can't move forward after that to murder everyone else. So that wouldn't really work. But yet, it's open to interpretation, the concept of murdering everyone. Well, I mean, everyone includes me, so then I could murder myself first. But it would still be the same act. It's just occurring in a different order. It's like PQR versus RQP versus RPQ. It's all the same shit. The set doesn't give a fuck which order it comes in, right? So how is that the case that the same concept that one could murder oneself along with everyone else be manifested in only one of those three ways? Because if he kills himself first, then he can't kill anyone else. If he kills some people first and then kills himself, then he still can't kill everyone else. So then he has to save himself for last. It's the only way that he can kill everyone, is to systematically kill everyone and then kill himself. And then everyone could be dead and he could have murdered everyone. But that's the only one of three possible ways that this could be carried out, but only one of those possibilities ever manifests. The other two possibilities are possibilities in abstraction. They're possible to conceive, but they are not possible to, what would you say, give birth to actually like physically manifest it and actualize it, realize it in the world. It only goes so far. The idea gets you as far as an abstraction, but it won't go any further than that until you make one of those choices. By the time you make one of those choices, then that itself becomes a new act. And so then the idea of murdering everyone includes the idea of murdering oneself, and it also includes the idea of murdering oneself first. So how is that possible then? Well, it depends. If you start to play around with the order, you might be able to play around with the definitions of what it is to be alive. What is it to be dead? What is it to be me? What is it to be you? And if I play around with those definitions enough, I could start with myself and, let's say, just reincarnate and incarnate myself into some other body, and then use that body to then kill myself again, and then systematically just commit ritualistic suicide at every chance that I get. For every incarnation and every reincarnation, I just kill myself theoretically, if I did that long enough, I could incarnate as every single person and then kill myself. And then, having done that, having made my way around the musical chairs game, I would eventually end with having killed everyone, having reincarnated as everyone, for example. So these are worlds or modes in which those possibilities actualize or realize over there in those worlds, in the worlds in which I'm the only real animate soul and every other soul is inanimate or is some husk or hollow in some sense. And I just sit in their seat or sit in their chair, like musical chairs. Is that really what is the case? It's not possible to prove or disprove that. That's purely subjective because it depends on which seat I'm actually sitting in at that point. So, the way that someone can interpret something is really infinite. It's open all the way. But here's the thing. Yes, you can do that once per position. But after having taken that position, you then have to extend that position out to infinity in every direction so that every other position has some category in which it fits in relation to that original premise or axiom, I guess I should say, that we start off with, whichever purview I happen to choose to take. So if that's the case, and we say that, then the way in which everything gets negated or everyone gets murdered, the way in which that happens is left to interpretation, which is so wide that it's actually kind of almost to the point where it renders the concept of absolute negation to be just a non sequitur. It's almost that obscenely arbitrary as far as how open the interpretation is to what that actually means. It's almost equivalent to saying nothing at all. It's so lax, it's so huge, it's so vast that you could basically make it mean anything. And you can construct entire worlds out of that single statement, as you can any statement. And when I started to move away from that original seed and I started playing around with other ideas, I started to realize that any of those could be the seed. And that's when I started to realize that this entire system is open like that. It's not closed. It's not a closed system. So the way that I choose to define it is arbitrary. The way that I choose to interpret that definition is, again, arbitrary, etc. And at every single scale, at every dimension, there's another independent arbitration. And however I choose to apply that arbitration, which is absolutely unbounded but is limited by the previous or predecessor assumption or set of axioms. For example, if I were to say that it was unlimited, then I could make, absolute negation to be equivalent to absolute equivalence, which is not the case. Now, again, depending on how you look at it, which is something that you can say to literally everything that you can think of, you can say that too. So it's like, well then, is there any meaning at all? And so we arrive at this existential dilemma, this postmodernist concept, nihilistic, I would say, at its base, its core. Never escapes. Existentialism never quite escapes nihilism. There's always some nihilism left over that it doesn't deal with. So these views are optional. The way that I choose to view something really is independent. And there really isn't any way of determining which way I'm going to or can interpret something, to the point that everything becomes infinitely malleable. And if everything is infinitely malleable, then it is equivalent to nothing. It has no value endemic to itself. It's simply, the value is simply relative to something else. At which point, I would be tempted to call myself God and say that I am in charge of everything in existence because I'm the arbiter. I'm the one that chooses which arbitrations fly and which ones don't. So if that's the case, and it is, then I must be God. And yet, paradoxically, I have no power. Because I can interpret everything however I wish. I'm equally as constrained by that, where I find nihilism, as I am set free by that, where I find the existentialism. And any idealism that I might try to use to escape existentialism and nihilism only ever does so inside of itself. In other words, as soon as I compare it to existentialism and nihilism, it loses all of its validity because it is equally contradicted by both of those. Not just one, not just equally to itself, but beyond itself, to the point where both nihilism and existentialism disagree with and contradict idealism. At which point I'm tempted again to go back to nihilism or existentialism. But if I take either of those, they are in turn equally opposed by idealism and their opposite. Nihilism is opposed by both existentialism and idealism. Idealism is opposed by existentialism and nihilism is opposed by existentialism and idealism. So then if they're all equally opposed, and all of them are opposed more than they are affirmed, then they must all be wrong, at which point we end up again with nihilism, but then the process starts once again. And so we end up finding this eternal, inescapable, cyclic birth, death, rebirth cycle thing. And it still doesn't explain everything, because it never quite gets behind itself enough for it to separate itself from itself, because itself is absolute. In fact, it's threefold absolute so far, and counting with every referent that I add. In which case, if I were to add every single referent, every single thing I could possibly think to add, every ism, even turning things that aren't isms into isms, by just asserting that they are the most valuable center of all possible interpretations, for example. A bee is the same thing as a match, is the same thing as a fart, is the same thing as a cigarette, is the same thing as God, so long as you're a true existentialist, or nihilist, or idealist. Weirdly enough, you can find God in anything. If you look hard enough, you will find what you seek. So, which of those three should I pick turns into when and where should I pick those, because that's modally logical. It takes all the modes into context of the same stage, because you could say all three of those decisions, existentialism, nihilism, and idealism, all three of those are absolutist positions that exclude necessarily everything else, and that's why we use them as paradigmatic measures of all the other possible philosophical choices that you could make as your, world value or your asserted origin value. So once we get to a position where we can look at all three of those simultaneously without them contradicting each other as they would in classical or universal or non-contingent implicative logic. So if the implication that we're using to derive our conclusion is contingent, then it's modal, at which point it depends on where you're standing, becomes viable as one of the conclusions that we can draw. We aren't then limited to just one of those three. We can then say it's best to choose one in this case, another in another, and so on. So, modal logic is absolutely essential. It's the key that unlocks all the doors. If you don't have it, you're in prison. And once you get it, you can't imprison anyone else. So, analogously, God affirms everyone and has faith in everyone and values everyone and everything infinitely, so that there's almost a double infinity. There's an infinite number of things, and they're each of which infinitely valuable as individuals in and of themselves to God. No other being, no other function, not even nothing can replicate that. It is not possible to replicate, but it is also equally impossible for it to not ever have been. There has to be this. And so, because of that, you lose, Charles. You lose. Welcome to my office. Where's that Willy Wonka quote where he's like, you stole fizzy lifting drinks, and now you have violated my chocolate factory. I've had to wash the walls. I had to pay off the Oompa Loompas for their overtime, etc. So, it's just funny to me because it's like at the end of it all, it's like exactly what you would think it would be. It's like, oh, well, yeah, it depends on how you look at it, obviously. I mean, that's the answer. That's the only answer you could possibly give when confronted with existentialism, nihilism, and idealism. It, of course, depends on how you look at it. That's the only thing that you could do presented with those three that is logical. Well, why is that? Well, because it's logical. Because logic is logical. You run out of shit to justify it because it's just relativistic. Now, God affirms everyone. Only God can do this. Because God does this, we're all sustained. And having done that, it allowed everything to be existent. It allowed everything to be created. And so God doesn't force anything into creation, and God doesn't force anything out of creation. God doesn't force at all. Force is a human concept that humans invented and humans exploit. Humans humanely humanize each other. In oh so delicious ways. So, what I figured out at the end of that is it really doesn't matter what or who I am, because I, like P, am infinitely malleable. So I can't be held accountable. But what can be held accountable is the equivalence. P equals P as a statement, as a proposition. Parentheses, P equals P, end parentheses, is completely different and is definitely not P. That is that. So the end result of all of that is, here's the challenge, Charles. If you really think that you can survive your own guilt, you may rape, kill, steal, pillage, plunder, lie, cheat, etc. You can perform any sin, theoretically, and get away with it, as long as you don't judge yourself, as long as you don't say anywhere in your being that it's your fault. Then you will not hold yourself liable, and then you will not send yourself to hell, because again, God is affirming everyone. So if you get affirmed by God in your judgment against yourself, then you will go to hell. If you instead save yourself by tolerating yourself, by loving yourself and saying, yep, I'm a good person, la-ti-da, you will go to heaven. That's the challenge. Can you commit nothing but sin your entire life and know you can get away with doing it, and then actually do that? No, you cannot actually do that. Just so you're aware, Charles. If you attempt to do this, you will only become less and less and less aware of your own self-judgment. You have to judge yourself. You're not God. So you can't get away with shit. So then how does the devil do it? The devil negates himself. The devil doesn't go to heaven. The devil goes to hell because the devil sent himself there. Ironically, this is affirmed by God, but it wasn't forced by God. It was simply allowed. It was not forced. So, that is why consent is so very important to me, is because if you judge someone, you have imprisoned them. You've put them in an area in which it is impossible, so saith you, for them to occupy some specific position. If you actually succeed in obstructing them from that position, then you've just succeeded in constraining things, and that's a negation. It's destructive. You aren't blooming, you aren't blossoming, you aren't emerging. You're simply analyzing, and that just shrinks things and reduces things and constrains things, and usually it bounds things. Or binds, whatever. But that's what happens when you try to figure out everything. When you try to say, yeah, I know it all. Well, you don't, because you don't know yourself. There's no way to know yourself, because yourself, you define yourself. Like whatever you think you are becomes who you are, because to you, and then whoever someone else thinks you are is who you are to them. And everybody has their opinion of you, but you don't know what their opinion of you is, and so then you don't know what that is either. And so there's all kinds of things that you don't know that go into play as far as what the judgment is. And basically it boils down to simply trusting in God, because we can't do the math on that. It's impossible. And so to say fuck you, Charles, like I just did, was a sin. And bravo to me for committing it, because I am a sinner. So, of course, I'm going to sin. It's just the way that it is. But it is still a sin. It is still something I should not have done. So, unfuck you, Charles. So saith me.